My story involves myself and three of my really good friends throughout my whole childhood. We'll have them go by Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy. I'm still good friends with them to this day. One of my friends actually suffered a nervous breakdown after this incident and needed counseling. I would like you to know I've always been a skeptic on the paranormal and find it very hard to believe in most aspects, but I love to watch, listen, and read on it, simply because I like to have an open mind in life. An open mind, in my opinion, is a growing one. Whether this was paranormal or not, I'm not sure. But something was clearly there that night. During the midsummer, me and a couple of my good friends who I mentioned, all the way through childhood, have always made time to go up to one of my friends' family cabins way up north in the forests of Minnesota. Throughout all of our young years, we would always go, accompanied by my friend's dad, Kevin. His dad owned the cabin, and sometimes our dads would come as well. Once we were juniors in high school, we felt mature and old enough to go to this cabin on our own, without dads or any other adult supervision. My friend's cabin is very remote and very small based upon the large scale of the island. Other cabins were on the island as well, but the next one close to us was a solid quarter or half-mile away at least, which you could get to by taking a man-made path around the island. I want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of the island, as his cabin was on an island, and take his boat across the lake about a half a mile. This lake is huge. My mind always had a tendency to run around when sleeping there at night through all my years. It was all one level, with only 2 bedrooms next to one another, a kitchen and living room connected, and a bathroom in the back. Where you slept in the cabin, there was always at least one window in each room with no curtains to it at all. It was easy to see outside into the woods and the lake, and this is where my mind would run. I always thought someone or something was peering in. Of course, nobody ever was. I had been to this cabin a dozen times throughout my lifespan, and nothing ever happened, and the older I got, the easier it was for me to sleep. We would usually stay 4 or 5 nights to a week. On the 3rd night during this trip, when we were out there on our own finally, we had set up a campfire and had been drinking all night. We went out to the dock to gaze up at the magnificence of the stars and enjoy ourselves when, all of a sudden, we hear something out at the water that sounded like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked out at the lake with curiosity, wondering where the splash came from. We had our poles ready 24/7. Thankfully, the moon was out that night, which helped it light up the lake. Otherwise, it would have been too dark to see anything, there being no city lights for miles upon miles. The moon was the only reason we were able to see what was on the lake. My friend Ryan began to point, saying, "What is that?" After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, all I can describe it was, it simply looked like a head out in the middle of the lake, just floating there, staring directly at us. It was a few dozen meters out from the dock, and there was no question that we could see its features. It had long black hair and very pale skin on its face, but we couldn't very well make out the eyes, mouth, nose, or chin, as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair over it. But I still knew that it was looking at me. I'll never forget the feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck, arms all stood up, and I was paralyzed. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a loon, as these birds are very popular night drifters on the lake and do their hunting late. They also have black with white colors on their coats and hunt by diving into the water holding their breath for minutes at a time. It was very possible that a loon would all of a sudden pop up in the water after hunting a bit. At least we tried to talk ourselves into that scenario. All of us had the creeps, and we began noticing it wasn't moving one bit. just treading water in the same place. We went back to our campfire, lit it even brighter, and headed inside to drink more. I want to mention that there was a staircase outside my friend's cabin, about 8 stairs in length, down to the bottom where the fire pit and dock was. We soon forgot about the head with the help of our beverages, until I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the one inside was preoccupied. I just went outside to do my business, since we were in the great outdoors. While I was out there, I began glancing at the beautiful moonlit lake. I noticed that the object was still there, but about 30 yards closer now, still looking as if it were staring right at me. Now I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. It was very pale, like it had been in the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went inside and told my friends to come look, keeping my eyes glued to it at the cabin door. They came outside to see it, still there, looking at us, as if this head was corked up at us with its chin in the air. Nobody dared go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, ruling out that it probably wasn't a loon, because a loon wouldn't tread water in the same spot that long. For it to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense at all. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck. There was no ripple effect at all in the lake from the object. We told ourselves it was just a log and went back in, but I could tell everyone else felt uneasy as well. A few more hours passed. It was super late into the night at this point, and we knew we needed sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside once more, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, thinking the log must have floated off or just hit shore somewhere. We slept with the windows open that night. There was no AC in this cabin, and we had to open them up or we'd fry ourselves. It was the middle of summer. Me and my other friend Tommy slept in the living room, while my other 2 friends slept in the 2 separate bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes shut tight, I began to hear someone walking around at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin around the campfire. I was terrified. There was no question what or whoever I heard was down there at the dock, pacing back and forth as it made the sound of a boot clicking on the wood. It was like they weren't sure what to do with themselves, and it lasted for a few minutes. I wanted to whisper to my friend, but I was frozen in fear. I just kept my eyes shut and my ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 steps up the deck, all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting out down the man-made path. After it sounded like the steps were long gone, and a couple of minutes had passed, I woke up Tommy, asking if he had heard the steps. Both of us were sitting up. I was startled to find my friend Ryan walking out of his room and saying we need to leave. He must have heard us talking, so he felt he could come out as well. But either way, he was waking us up regardless. Something was very disturbing about his expression, and I asked him why. He woke up Kevin in the other room and said, "Let's go, get the boat, it's time to go." Asking him, "What is wrong with you?" He explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff, and I will never forget what he explained. Either will my other friends. He said he was turning sides on his bed to get more comfortable, and he saw something peeking in at him at the top right corner of his window, and it quickly shifted out of his view. He said all he saw was one eye, ghostly white skin, and black hair long down the window. Another thing, when we look back at what happened, it chills us to the bone realizing that since this face was in the top right corner of the window in my friend's room he was sleeping in, this thing was either near 8 feet tall or standing on something, trying to peek in, or maybe floating. Ryan then continued to say that we need to go very seriously. I felt like I was going to be sick. We all agreed and packed our stuff and booked it out, not cleaning the cabin or anything. We locked up and headed down the stairs. We saw barefoot prints in the dirt heading off into the path and all around the cabin. We picked up our step, getting to the boat, not knowing what was watching us or around us. Threw our stuff on, untied it, and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water anymore, or to look in the water, thank God. My eyes were just glued to the island, trying to spot anything moving, but I saw nothing. When we finally got our stuff packed in the car and the boat tied, we took off. We had been driving out about 10 miles, and out of the blue, Ryan, who said he saw the person outside of his windows, all of a sudden broke down in the car sobbing. We called to tell our parents what happened on the way back, and Ryan was freaking out, and they told us just to get home safely and quickly. It was about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept, and it was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, who owns the cabin, went up that following weekend and said he experienced nothing while there, but did mention weird footprints were still lingering about, which he thought odd, and someone walking around his property bugged him very badly. Whatever my friend saw in the window really hit him hard. After this breakdown, he had trouble sleeping. He ended up having to seek some help for a few weeks and get some medicine. As time went on, he ended up being fine, but he still isn't comfortable sleeping next to a window without a curtain. To this day, I cannot explain what happened and why it seemed to happen to us, and I can't explain what I saw in the lake or what Ryan saw. Nothing has ever happened at that cabin since that night. At least, that's what we're told from my friend's dad who owns it, but I believe him. I just personally have never decided to go back, which really makes me sad because I had great childhood memories there. Tommy and Kevin both have gone back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to go back, and I don't blame him. My pops and I are avid campers, not professionals anymore, but my dad did used to be a wilderness guide for kids. We typically prefer the eastern or western Sierras, as they have great car camping spots next to lakes and a lot of great trails. Last summer, we decided to go up for a 2-night stay and do some day hiking. The campground was pretty full, not unusual for the summer, but we were lucky enough, I thought at the time, to find a pretty secluded site, and we set up our tents. The first night was fairly normal. A little bear activity, but we're used to that. Second night, I crawl into my backpacking tent. Head and toes hit both ends. It's very small, but I pass out cold until about 3 a.m. when I wake up to the sound of footsteps. My dad is a diabetic and needs to get up to use the bathroom around 3 or 4 times a night, and the sounds are definitely footprints, but they're coming from the wrong direction. We're located next to the bathrooms, so the footsteps should be moving in that direction, but instead they're coming closer to my tent. They stop about a yard short, and I hear breathing getting really heavy. I first brush it off as my dad may be lost without a flashlight. The breathing goes away. I fall back asleep, only to be awoken a few minutes later to breathing directly above the tent. You know that rush of terror you get up your spine? I had that because this wasn't my dad. I laid perfectly still, but the footprints continued to circle the tent. I had the rain fly on, so I couldn't see through the roof, and it was a new moon and pitch black. Now, I convince myself, a heavy sleeper, that I'm dreaming. Just as that thought runs through my head, I feel a single finger run the length of my foot throughout the tent. Real slow and methodical. I have to be dreaming because my foot is in my sleeping bag and I couldn't possibly feel that. That comfort disappeared very quickly when I realized, using the small ambient light available, that my foot was bare and out of the bag. I laid frozen as whatever it was stroked my foot for a minute or two. gave a few more labored breaths, and then just stood above my tent for what felt like an eternity before disappearing. I stayed up all night. In the morning, I heard my dad get out of his tent. I bolted up and met him by the fire. He looked me in the eye and asked if I had gotten up in the night before. I asked him the same, and he said he had around 2 a.m. because he thought someone was going through our stuff. As I told him my story, we noticed our gear had been neatly arranged on the table. Every single item, nothing taken, and footprints in a perfect circle around my tent. We still don't talk about it. I work as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California. The place is very out in the woods, so we get all sorts of animals wandering through, from deers and foxes, coyotes howling in the distance, to a mountain lion that's been spotted in the area. The camp also occasionally has a very haunted vibe. There are a couple creepy and weird spots. Some things in the area that we think show the place has been inhabited in the past. One night, after putting my kids to bed, I was standing outside our cabin talking to another counselor when my friend comes running by with her entire teenage girls' cabin, maybe 12 of them, all dressed in black and freaking out. She screams at me that she thought they heard a ghost. Once her kids were asleep, she'd meet me back here to explain and investigate. Sadie's normally the level-headed type not to freak out easily, so this really caught my attention. She meets me back by my cabin maybe 30 minutes later and explains what was going on. She took her campers on a night hike, had them all dress up in black so they could pretend to be sneaky like ninjas. All was fun until on their way back they passed a particularly dark part of the trail. Off in the distance, just beyond the tree line, they heard someone saying help very faintly. It sounded like it was coming from a small child, but each time they heard it, it got more and more distorted until it no longer sounded human. It just sounded like a child yelling in the distance. Naturally, they freaked out and ran. We decided to be good counselors and go investigate the sound of a small child yelling help. As we walk over to the area of the trail, we hear it. It didn't sound like a small child anymore. It sounded like a demon screeching out its best impression of a child shouting help. It didn't sound like it was coming from any point source, but was coming from the entire mountainside. We booked it back to the safety of the main part of camp, where we tell the story to anyone who will listen. No one believed us, but we know what we heard. I had an interesting experience while camping with my husband a couple of weeks ago. It was a nice drive-in campsite, a corner spot next to one other campsite and woods on the other 3 sides. We had a nice day hiking, cooked some fajitas and s'mores over the fire, then we settled into our tent to sleep. Later that night, I woke up and heard a weird noise. It sounded kind of like an electronic tone. Then I heard what sounded like people talking right outside of my tent. They were saying something about someone better get out of that tent. Thinking that there must be other campers walking around, I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. A couple minutes later, I heard the strange tone noise again, and then what sounded like a cat meowing and walking around the tent. It sounded like my cat when he wants to be let into the house. I'm not about to let strange animals into my tent, so I just lay there, and it stopped after about a minute. A couple of minutes later, I heard the tone once again. Then I heard a lower, gravelly voice talking outside the tent. They better get out of there before I get them. All of this happened over the course of maybe 10 minutes. I didn't react as strongly as I probably should have, but I was tired and thought at first it might be some kind of dream. My husband got up and left the tent to use the bathroom a little while later. He hadn't heard anything, and I didn't hear anything else after that. The next morning while eating breakfast, I could hear the neighboring campers talking. One of their children, 5-7 years old, was upset with his brother because they had heard someone telling them to get out of the camper last night, and now his brother was denying that he had heard anything. I'm not sure exactly what happened that night, but I feel like something was trying to lure people out of the safety of their tents and campers. My friend and I are avid outdoorsmen, primitive camping, hiking, etc. There's a local county park with a weird, spooky history. Lots of people with odd sightings, menacing experiences, supposedly witchcraft. You get the idea. Well, we were hiking there and decided to follow a couple of game trails. We wanted to get away from the casual hikers and really explore the more unexplored parts of the forest. We had gone several miles in when we came to an area with a lower bush line, so our visibility was pretty good. All of a sudden, a storm of acorns erupted around us with no wind to speak of. After this incident, we had this overwhelming sense of being watched. We had gone another several hundred yards when my friend calls out, "What is that?" When I look towards what he's pointing at, we see this dark humanoid shape standing by a tree. It was around 4 feet tall, dark brown, maybe black in color, and it seemed to get highly agitated when I took notice of it. The only way to describe its movement was that it was lightly bouncing back and forth, giving off a very aggressive vibe. Instinctively, we both pull out our knives. My friend also pulled out his axe, as we felt combat was inevitable. It keeps watching us, emanating this harsh energy. For some reason, we decided to move towards it. What happened next, I cannot explain. It simply disappeared. Once we both see it disappear, we make a beeline to the tree it was at. We can be brave and stupid. There's no sign or sound of anything being there. We look around and nothing. There was no way for it to have gotten away without making a sign or a noise. The brush just wouldn't have allowed that. We sheathed our weapons and stood there dumbstruck, not sure what had happened.